Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. This is the second lecture in Wedge Gallery opening of the fall semester here at Woodbury University. Tonight we have Andrew Kovacs with us, who is going to be giving a lecture and also has done an installation in the Wedge Gallery. A brief little information on Andrew Kovacs. Andrew is an assistant adjunct professor at UCLA, Architecture and Urban Design, where he teaches design studios and seminars at both undergraduate and graduate level. From 2012 to 2013, Kovacs was the inaugural UCLA Teaching Fellow. Kovacs studied architecture at Syracuse, where he earned his Bachelor of Architecture, the Architectural Association in London, and Princeton University, where he earned his Master of Architecture. Kovacs is the creator and curator of Archival Affinities, a widely viewed website devoted to collecting and displaying architectural B-sides. Kovacs Design Studio, Office Kovacs, works on projects at all scales, from books, exhibitions, temporary installations, interiors, homes, speculative architectural projects, and public architecture competitions. So this semester at Woodbury, we have a bit of a theme, or at least a kind of subjectivity we're focusing on. And that's on the topic of an architectural practice in regard to an architectural project. And so I'd like to show you, we have a short video of Andrew Kovacs installing the Wedge Gallery, but also discussing these topics. Could someone get the lights, please?
We have an older model of the Wedge Gallery here because the most current model was sent to an artist in Michigan named Aaliyah, who will make a video installation on our model and then send it back to us, and we'll display it right here in the gallery. Okay, so the stools are interesting. The seats, I mean, not stools, the seats are interesting. So in many of these models of found objects, or these models that we produce made from found objects, we kind of use these pieces as seats. And so we decided to scale one up and basically make this as seats for the exhibition or installation at Woodbury to watch Aaliyah's film. We're basically going window shopping. So we need a window for our installation. Hi, are you open? We're standing outside, but the gate is locked. Okay. Thank you. Just in the back with a customer. Yeah, these are great.
I have windows in here, and I have windows back there.
Okay. Isn't this place great? This is a good one. How high did we have it?
We had it 5.5 feet.
Oh, this is perfect.
Is this it?
5.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks. I wiped it down a little bit. Perfect. So we bought a window. We went window shopping. About close to being done with the framing of the platform and of the wall, and what we're about to do as soon as those pieces are drilled in is we're going to take these walls and lay them up against that wall and move this platform into its position in the gallery. Michael, should we basically lift it this way and then move them? storefront. Difference between a project and a practice, I mean, I think we struggle with that every day. Like, the way I understand project is like in a kind of capital P sort of way, right? Like, so what's your architectural project in the sense of what do you contribute to the discipline and discourse of architecture? I would say the driving thread through all things is the approach and sensibility, strategy of composition, organization of, say, colors, et cetera, like use of everyday building material, use of everyday materials, things that are everyday, things that can be found, things that are cheap, things that are readily available. Also how one thinks of what a practice is, right? Like there's an amazing video from the basketball player Allen Iverson where it's a press conference and everyone wants to ask him about practice because he missed practice. And he goes on for a very long time sort of critiquing the journalist, saying, you want to talk about practice. Why do you want to talk about practice? Not the game. Not the game that he gives his all for.
It's not the game. We're talking about practice, man. I mean, how silly is that, man? We're talking about practice.
Right? So it's super interesting what you kind of mean by practice, right? So is it something you do every day? Is it something you try and refine or try and improve?
So you never.
Day two, we're close to finishing the platform. The walls are being put up. The table has started. And I think we're going at a pretty good pace. It's the last night of our installation in the Wedge Gallery. Tomorrow night will be the opening, so we're just wrapping up and I'll also give a lecture. We can go look and see what the status is. But so the idea is we've taken the kind of footprint of the Wedge Gallery and made a kind of platform and that mimics the shape of the gallery, and then a single wall so then here you would have a kind of seating area because a film or a video will be screened. We like bright colors, and we also like things that are color blocked, and we like to kind of see how those colors relate against other colors in a kind of overall composition. And then this is meant to be a little table made of paint splatter. On the other side here of the wall, there's an opening and a number of purple lavender CMUs that will have plants in them tomorrow. So it'll be up until October 26th or 23rd or so. And then after that, Christy Vallier and her partner will have an exhibition in here, and they will give the next lecture. So yeah, it'll stay up for about a month. So make sure you come see it.
So hopefully that gave a little insight into Andrew's project and also his practice. Please join me in welcoming Andrew Kovacs to the stage.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Thank you for coming. Thank you to Woodbury University for doing this. And thanks for Ryan. Ryan failed to mention that it was his film. And he did such a great job that I'm not sure I'm going to be able to follow up that well. But anyways, this talk is called Show and Tell. So some of you probably know about show and tell. I'm sure all of us had to kind of do it at one point. In some ways, I feel like architecture school, or like the reviews of architecture school, is a little bit like show and tell, right? Like you're sort of presenting your projects to a kind of audience around you. And so in some ways, I sort of feel that that's kind of what this presentation will be. So when 5 years ago or so, 6 years ago, I came to Los Angeles to teach at UCLA, and this was one of the first projects I did kind of on my own. It's pretty extreme if you look at it. But I was sort of thinking, so this is one of the people that came to visit. She's smiling, so clearly she's not an architect, because she sort of enjoyed the exhibition. But at the time I was sort of thinking about kind of images or things like this. So this is foreman William Tallman, seems to hang precariously from the lower rim of the roughed out eye of Jefferson at Mount Rushmore. And so I was kind of, thinking that this sort of model was a kind of space for architectural mountaineering. One where maybe the normal rules of building didn't apply, and people could sort of freely build a kind of an architectural environment that they could then sort of climb across, basically. And so these are some of the images of that model, which I haven't really shown to anyone, but I'm sort of kind of thinking about them a little bit more these days. And this was also kind of in the show. There were other sort of models made of found objects or ready-mades, sort of composed in sort of thinking about like a kind of, say, fantastical architecture. And there were even objects that weren't assembled that I had just sort of collected that I somehow, for some reason, found interesting. And on the wall of this gallery in Chinatown, we had screen printed a collection of images that I have been gathering maybe since 2010. And so that project is called Archive of Affinities. This was actually the announcement for the exhibition at that time. It was called Goods Used in Architectural Yard Sale, and this was the advertisement I made and put on Craigslist for people to come. And so this was really one of the first times I displayed the project of Archive of Affinities. So Archive of Affinities is the longest project that I've worked on to date. It's a project that has no deadline, no client, and no budget. But I would say the content of it is very much architectural. And so in kind of collecting all these images, I was sort of kind of trying to map out what people mean by the discipline or discourse of architecture. And I was also looking for images of work that I had never seen before. And so, over time, I had sort of started to amass this collection, and this was the first time that this project was sort of displayed. And at the time, I wasn't really thinking of it as a project. I still kind of am not sure if it really is a project, but it's sort of, for me at least, leads to a lot of other projects. And so, at one point, the project was kind of exhibited at the Graham Foundation here as a kind of collection of images that I had gathered over time, images that I had made from those images, as well as objects that I had started to collect. And here's a kind of other version of the same sort of display. And one thing to note about all these images that I was gathering, I was scanning them myself. So I couldn't the reason I started doing that is I wasn't able to find very obscure projects on the internet. Or if I did, they were very low resolution, or they were mislabeled or labeled incorrectly. And so in order to kind of, the scanner then became this kind of way for me to kind of sort of track or make sure the sources of, or the images were properly sourced. But around, at some point, through collecting sort of physical objects, I also started to digitize them or use the scanner to document them, here in a kind of sort of two views, as if to suggest a kind of plan or elevation. And so, that has kind of, the scanner as a tool has kind of had many different uses for us. And, this is an image from last summer where we produced a model for the Chicago Architecture Biennial, which I'll show. And here, we didn't make drawings of that model, but for us it was important to find a way to sort of produce documentation outside of just the physical model. And so here we documented the debris and the dust of the construction of the model. And then that has kind of also sort of changed here, an image made by Aaron Wright, as a kind of instant elevation composed just on the scanner, or here an image made by Israel Seha, where these are the sort of leftover bits of the model parts we used to make these models. And so, when I started scanning them, I started to think like, what are, many of these things were souvenirs or miniaturized, and so it was important to kind of recognize what their actual size is. But there were also sort of other silly experiments, like kind of taking, these are some of the sort of early versions of this, or kind of starting to, once they were digitized, to sort of assemble them again into kind of speculative architectural proposals. And so, these were sort of images I was making at the time, when I was kind of gathering, I was really just kind of playing. I was sort of playing with the images that I was digitizing. And then these sort of became kind of architecture, in a way, like sort of architectural thought experiments, right? Like, could you actually sort of imagine a colossal Rubik's Cube defined by the 1 mile Jefferson grid? And so, the kind of, these fragments were digitized and you could say archived as a kind of matter of record of the materials we were using, but at the same time, those images were then, say, recomposed in Photoshop to propose sort of architectural speculations or thought experiments. So it's a sort of interesting back and forth where, the scanner is used as a kind of way to almost like for legalistic reasons, and so we were kind of trying to use this machine in a sort of different way. And, that kind of led then to thinking or sort of making these speculations for, say, architecture competition. So this was our unsubmitted entry for the Guggenheim Helsinki competition a few years ago, which I don't think nothing has ever happened to that project. But these models were basically made from sort of collecting objects that already exist in the world and recomposing them, and then in this particular case, totally desaturated or neutralized by painting everything a single color. This was the kind of plan of it. And so around that time, I was also starting to think about the use of these ready-mades or these found objects and what it sort of means also in terms of kind of composing them or compacting them together. And around this time, I met some individuals that owned an Airstream, and they wanted to convert it into a mobile store. And so in that sense, the Airstream became this sort of ready-made. Also that, it had a kind of leisurely function, and then they had transformed it already once into something else, and then now they wanted to transform it into something, again, a mobile store. And so that's basically what we did. And so in some sense, those two projects, I think, were kind of in conversation with each other in terms of my thinking about architecture at the time. Like, how could we sort of, at one level, the found objects were used to kind of make a model that was a speculation, but in the Airstream project, the found objects or the same found objects that were used in the Guggenheim model became a kind of apparatus in the Airstream to hang bathing suits on, which was their business. And so here, just some images of the Guggenheim model. And then here, the kind of Airstream, where so in some sense, what was interesting also about the Airstream is that the objects had to be of a certain size and weight, and they also had to kind of be able to have a hanger put on them. And so some, were kind of also referencing like the famous Magritte painting of a train coming out of a wall. So this idea of, say, ready-mades, or kind of things that already exist, or say finding things that already exist in the world and using that as, say, material to assemble something else, started to kind of play itself out in these types of projects, which I haven't really shown in a long time. So these are built speculative buildings. These buildings have no clients. I was just kind of making these buildings for fun, but I was sort of scouring Bing Maps at the time and kind of sort of collecting existing buildings that are in the world, but images of them, and then kind of reassembling them in Photoshop just as kind of simple thought experiments. But but here you kind of see the same process of, say, collecting things, altering them slightly, and recomposing them into something new. What was sort of interesting about that at that time is that I would share them on the internet, and then all of a sudden, like I noticed, like, this particular building started to appear on all these blogs, and I had kind of no idea why. But I started to then think about, say, the dissemination of images in architecture and what that kind of means, right? Like how do we sort of, say, communicate to a broader audience outside of just our own kind of field? And so, I mean, to me, these images are very sort of funny and amusing because, like, I have no idea why this building, speculative building, really an image made from other images, circulates the internet. But it was really just kind of made for fun. Does anyone know who did this drawing? Stanley Tigerman. So, it's a sort of weird thing. Like, why is this building next to a screenshot of Marilyn Manson saying, "Hello, MTV, this is Marilyn Manson, and welcome to my Maryland mansion"? But I wasn't sort of really, I was just really making these buildings to kind of think about architecture, right? And I would put them on the internet to share with people, but I was really kind of just making them for myself. Nothing ever really kind of happened with these until kind of this moment. So this was basically one of these kind of speculations, a very simple one. Here, this is the existing building, the screenshot, and then kind of manipulated slightly and then altered further. But so what was interesting about this is I was asked to participate in an exhibition called 5x5, put on by Kyle May and Julia Vanderhout from New York, and they did this exhibition all over the United States, which is great. I love it when you get to do an exhibition and you make one thing and then someone else travels it around, because then you instantly get like 4 or 5 lines on your CV. And so for that project, I thought, okay, well, why don't we try and make one of these, like physically make, because this was just an image made from other images. And so we then had to sort of re-engineer or digitally model the image, which is pretty straightforward. But this was the sort of kind of idea, a number of Villa Savoies stacked on top of each other. And then, so since we had to make this model for this exhibition, I thought, well, why not then use this model and submit it to a competition? We did not win this competition, but I think that also goes to maybe thinking about Ryan's question about project and practice. So, these are just kind of made for fun, or me thinking about architecture. And then at some point, they're sort of mobilized into exhibitions, or in this case, a competition this was the Socrates Sculpture Park Folly competition that we did not win. But what we had basically proposed was that this could be a miniature water tower catch basin. Right, so we could reconfigure the proposed building that it could catch rainwater, and I think that was also part, if I remember correctly, part of the brief at the time, that it should have some sort of function. So, and then here, the model as part of an exhibition meant or presented with a totally other narrative here as a kind of tower made for investment. So I think that in some sense, like, this kind of aspect of play, or just kind of messing around with things and making sort of, ridiculous buildings or ridiculous ideas for architecture, kind of, then started to get mobilized either into exhibitions or architecture competitions. And all of that in a way sort of comes out, or the origin of it, or the sort of crucible of it, is this sort of ongoing, never-ending project of archive affinities. And a couple years ago, I was asked to be part of an exhibition as part of a sort of renegade exhibition at the Venice Architecture Biennial called the Unfolding Pavilion. And at the time, all the participants that they asked to be part of it all had some kind of internet presence in terms of architecture, or part of a kind of discourse of architecture, you could say, on the internet, if that's even possible. And so this was a number of pamphlets I had produced for this exhibition. And really the idea there was to kind of outline this approach, which I showed in the previous competition, that I sort of started to call making architecture from architecture, or sort of taking things that appropriating things that already exist in the world, finding things that already exist in the world, and using that as material to assemble something else. And so just a kind of quick example, like this was one of the pamphlets, a plan for a house in the form of a circle. And so, at this time, so here you actually see the literal scans. One is from a Mario Botta building, and the other is a Venturi Scott Brown building. And so, but I was also kind of, the project of Archive Affinities also, I think, comes out of thinking of things like Colin Rowe or Gerhard Richter's Atlas, or how one kind of, Gerhard Richter's Atlas, that he collects all these photographs and then uses them as the sort of reference material, inspiration material to create his paintings. And so, this kind of approach sort of started to continue into other architectural competitions, some where we had some minor success. For example, this particular project, which was a proposal for a new museum across this existing museum in Lima, Peru, and we proposed here kind of underground vitrine. This is just a kind of quick image of what the inside looked like. And so, this was sort of maybe another part of the practice in terms of that we were producing models to generate the representation as required by the competition brief. And so we continued to do that. And so then we sort of started making these small little physical models that we called, that Israel Seha called chingaderas. And then sort of we kind of altered the name to mean, or changed the nickname to be chichis. And so we were making these kind of like little follies or micro interventions as kind of further speculative proposals for competitions, and then started to digitize them or scan them on the actual, or on the book scanner, as a way to kind of create sort of other forms of representation of the work we were doing. This project, nothing ever happened to it, but we made this wonderful model of it. And then this happened. So around that time, I had somehow managed to find a client that wanted an interior renovation. And that kind of was also the sort of, say, origin maybe of my collaboration with Aaron Wright. And so this was the client's first location, and if you look at it, there's clearly a number of issues, but she wanted to sort of, do a tenant improvement into kind of changing this space. And so that kind of became, so the next series of slides are sort of parallel of, say, the kind of real thing we were working on that actually had a client that paid us money versus things that were kind of made for exhibitions and had rather modest budgets. So in what was interesting about this project was that over time, the client kept switching locations. So we basically kept redesigning the same thing over and over again for her in different locations. Thankfully, it did not happen in this location because there were a number of issues. So, but the reason I'm showing this is I think that the images on the right are things that we make as kind of speculations or really kind of what we would want to produce in the world, while the image on the left, we still want to make what we want to make, but we're kind of also at the mercy or we have to kind of meet the demands of someone else. And so, so here kind of in November, we kind of made this proposal to rethink the alleys in downtown Los Angeles. And so, again, here, these sort of small little models that we made and then digitized into this kind of overall collection. Here's just a kind of sample of them. And then in December of 2016, something interesting happened. So in order for the client to, the plan of the existing unit had this very funky wall right here, right? You see that? And it created basically a space that looked like this. And so this space was totally useless for the client, for anyone that would occupy this unit for commercial purposes. But it turned out that we were not able to kind of move this wall because it would require a kind of structural change on this end. That was only one of many problems that existed with this space. But around that same time, when we had this problem with this wall, we were producing these kind of wall collages, or kind of ideas of say, organizing just walls into a kind of space. And all the walls came from floor plans that were on Archive of Affinities, right? So, and then so all those walls could be traced back to, say, their origin or their source. And so, so thankfully this never happened. But then we were also starting to think, like, how can we maybe start to make these thought experiments, speculations bigger. And then this was a kind of, we were asked to make a proposal for something that never happened. This was kind of one version of it. So then in January 2017, the client then moved to another space, and we produced this design based on that location. And around that time, we were also asked to be part of the Chicago Architecture Biennial. And so, moving on into March, we actually designed the space for her, and then it turned out she didn't get the lease, so we had to then go to the next space. But also around this time, I was kind of very much interested in what was happening in Panama City, Panama. I don't know if you know, but it's now ranked 20th in the world in quantities of skyscrapers, and that sort of became the subject matter for a design studio at UCLA. Then in June 2017, she moved again to another location, and we produced kind of these renderings for her. Eventually, she did not make it in this location either, but around that same time, we were also still entering architectural competitions here for a proposal for a ferry terminal. The idea was that it would be a dome, a bar, and a box, all composed together with a kind of park-like space where the land meets the water. So then finally, in September of 2017, the client actually managed to sign a lease on a space, and this was the space. And then around that time, so it's quite like the juxtaposition of sort of bland offices to kind of these colorful creations that we were making at the time. And so the idea here of the Chicago Architecture Biennial, we were asked to rethink a well-known interior. And so our ambition was to kind of redo Sir John Soane's interior, but in a way to eliminate his collection and say update it with a collection for the 21st century, or maybe say if Sir John Soane had lived forever, maybe this is what he would have also started to collect. So this was the team, arranged by height: Summer, Aaron, myself. This is basically what we told the Chicago Biennial. We wanted to make an image or a model that looked like this, and they said, how are you going to do it? And we said, we're going to freestyle it. And that means featuring relatively free, unrestricted movement or intended to demonstrate an individual's special skills or style. And they said, okay, so we got to work, which basically meant going to 99-cent stores and finding things that resemble architecture, going to high-end paper stores and buying the kind of scrap as material to kind of clad or alter some of these objects, or going to, say, the street market where you never know what you will find. And then this is kind of what the studio ends up looking like. It gets very, very messy, but at the same time there's a lot of, say, care and attention put into kind of altering these objects. For example, this cupcake, which is actually, I think, a piggy bank, is sort of patched over to kind of alter its form, or kind of found everyday objects here. For example, the cap of a glue bottle used as a kind of planter. And so here I'll just quickly show images of the model. So, this model, I would say, the Chicago architecture biennial model, kind of came out from these sort of earlier models, right? Like, when I came to LA, I didn't really know anyone. I didn't have any clients. I didn't know how to get a client. So I thought, okay, well, what's the first thing you would do? Maybe an addition for a house. So this was my proposed addition for a house. And clearly nobody jumped on it, right? But these were, again, kind of, sort of speculations on what architecture could maybe be, made from things that I was sort of gathering over time. So this is the kind of, this model is known as the bust of Medusa that was part of a group show at Wedge Gallery in Chinatown. So then finally in November 2017, we were able to start construction on this on this tenant improvement. But at the same time we were entering these competitions that kind of, unfortunately, we never managed to get. But I think we're still trying to find a way to realize it. So here are the seats that are kind of in the gallery in Wedge Gallery, right? And so then, December 2017, the client was asking for more renderings, but we were also then making this competition proposal for for the medians of Park Avenue. This is a project that I really, really like. That's why I'm showing it to you, but also never happened. But again, to kind of make a sort of play space or kind of urban jungle gym in the kind of median of a city. So here's the kind of, and again, the idea, say, of the representation we produce is really about, say, making a model and using that model to then generate the representation. So then this is what the space looked like in February 2018. And then around that time, a young Belgian architect contacted me to enter this competition in Belgium for a performing arts center. I think it was we were way underqualified for it, but we still made a pitch. And so here the idea was that the buildings that would actually have the performing arts center here are all kind of rendered in white, and then around the performing arts center you would have a kind of terrace landscape, say, of pleasure and fun. So then finally in April 2018, we finished the interior in Beverly Hills, but we also then began thinking about another project that was going to happen in Nebraska. So now I'll just quickly show you the project in Beverly Hills. So this is what the interior looked like when we got it. This is what the project looked like under construction, and then this is what the project looked like completed. This is a plan of the existing unit. What we had basically proposed was to chop off part of another unit and kind of make this sort of headquarters, or say puzzle puzzle pieces of many different activities in one space. These are all the drawings that were required to get a permit for this tenant improvement, and so this kind of maybe better explains the concept of a kind of say puzzle pieces notching in together that each have different programmatic requirements. So kind of office, kind of small shop, a reception area, the rooms for facials, kind of nail salon, and then a kind of lounge. And so here's kind of overview of all of what the space looked like. And then this is the space kind of finished. And so we had proposed this kind of herringbone floor pattern that was then kind of translated into, say, the reception desk wall here in this kind of chevron pattern, or as a kind of the countertop for this shelf. So then kind of Omaha, this project in Omaha happened, which was super interesting. So this is a space that's owned by an architect named Thomas Prince, who's now also an artist. He went to SciArc, and at one point there was actually an architect's office in this space, but now they're sort of turning it into a gallery. But what was really interesting about his building is that he was constantly operating on it, right, or constantly doing sort of construction on it. So you can kind of see here the floor, and then there was kind of traces and leftovers from other artists that had done installations there. Here you kind of see the remnants of the wall. And so we were asked to kind of do something in there. And so, we were then thinking like, oh, we should try and build or realize some of these small models that, say, we had proposed for the alleys in downtown LA as a kind of one-to-one realization of them out of, basically with no budget, out of everyday building materials and kind of, limited time and us doing the work. So, not that many, not with a kind of licensed contractor. And so this was the kind of model we produced before we went there. These are some of the drawings, kind of thinking also about, say, how things are composed or how things might be pieced together, not just in terms of their materiality and texture, but also, say, the kind of qualities of color. So this is the installation in the space. It was really great because they were able to find a mason to donate their time to realize this brick wall. So the idea of this project is really just kind of two simple walls that we then kind of used to sort of test out these different, say, compositional strategies. And then here you can kind of see it and the actual wall makes a kind of V around an existing column that is in the space. This is sort of a detail shot of where the brick meets the next wall. And here where you kind of get a reveal of the red. So, if this was the kind of alleys project, in terms of thinking like, if we're just sort of assembling these kind of little fragments at the scale of a small architecture model, how can we start to kind of blow those up or realize them one-to-one? But we were also kind of thinking like, playing this game of architectural representation here, sort of using the scanner as a way to kind of document these objects and then kind of adding labels or calling out what they could be as maybe a way to, say, produce documents that are, say, parallel to architectural drawings. And then the Wedge Gallery happened. So this was our kind of initial thought to sort of start to make one of these little follies. And this was kind of the first initial models are really made in the same way, I think, as some of the more, say, speculative models, kind of just sort of made through playing and freestyling, basically. And then, once we sort of narrowed it down, figured out how much everything could cost, we produced a much nicer model, which was, a much nicer model. And then also we needed these seats, right? So as part of the installation. So, I think that there maybe is a kind of jump, say, from, thinking about these found objects made colossal to just sort of realizing them one-to-one. So here's are kind of the drawings produced for the Wedge Gallery. There's the basic composition is that there's this sort of platform that takes the footprint of the Wedge Gallery. And then that is kind of built by Michael Pickoff, who's, if the apocalypse comes, Michael will probably survive it and then help rebuild the world. So covered here in sheathing and then pegboard, and then the wall, which is kind of just made out of framing, and then covered in drywall, and then on one side a kind of vinyl lattice, which is purchased at Lowe's and painted blue. And then here are shots of the model. You can, once this lecture is over, you can go into the gallery and compare and see how close it is. And so one of the things that sort of happened in Omaha was that, we kind of didn't know if we could actually do this sort of wall assembly, or that we ourselves could build or produce this installation. And so there was also a limited amount of time, but after doing it, I think all of us got a little bit more confident that, yeah, we can kind of realize one of these. So we then were thinking like, well, what else could this installation do? How could we sort of reach out to a broader audience or find other people that might be interested in architecture as a way to, say, broaden the discussion? And so there's this artist I discovered that I've never met, but she makes these amazing videos that are kind of, that oscillate between being creepy and cute, And she uses sort of miniatures and assembles these sets, and then either has like snails climbing through them or uses like slime over them. And so we thought that it would be really fun if she could make a video on our model, as I mentioned in Ryan's movie. And so the movie is also playing in the gallery, and you can check it out. So thank you to everyone that helped and made this happen. Thanks.
Thanks, Andrew.
Yeah.
That was great.
Thanks.
Love the work. I'd like to open up questions to the audience. I know it's getting cold, but does anyone in the audience have any questions about the lecture?
Thanks, Andrew. So first off, I'd just like to say thank you for being frank or candid within your description of process.
Yeah.
Or practice. I think that's super valuable within an academic setting for sure. And I think you alluded to the answer to my question, but I thought I'd ask you directly. Translating from the speculative to the real, and it's more about changing scale. Do you within your idea or the ideal? Would it be about assuming and then repurposing these objects, or is that just about the design process? Meaning, from what you showed as images of the model for the Wedge Gallery, the stools are something here, but when it comes to the real scale, it becomes a different material. Do you think your ideal, if you were to move to the scale of a large building or to a tower, would it be about assuming or gathering large objects, or is that just about?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
I guess maybe I'll reframe the question, right? And so I guess the question would be how can you work with ready-mades in architecture, right? And so maybe that's also where kind of this idea of, say, making architecture from architecture kind of comes from, or even the Tenant Improvement project, right? It's already an existing building. So in some sense, maybe I'm not at the scale of going after a tower. I don't have an office that can go after a tower, right? So I have the types of projects that I have that we can do are much smaller, right? And so maybe they, at the moment I haven't thought about how it could be a tower. Maybe the towers that I showed that were images made from Bing Maps, I think maybe that would be the start, right? But maybe another way to think of the ready-made is the building itself that already exists, or the found objects do get bigger, right? Or say a construction system, right? A sort of method of building things in a way might also be kind of thought of as, say, a ready-made system. I don't know if
that's potent. That's good.
Yeah.
So I have a question about the archive of affinities. I've been for years probably way too much of a follower of that, and you presented it as in the overall series of images you showed at the beginning as a kind of gradient or continuum.
Sure.
But actually, if I remember correctly, there's some really interesting sort of lurching changes that happen in it, right? So that all of a sudden there's the advertisements for architecture, or so could you, where does that come from? I mean, in practice, it might come from a kind of, real constraint, right, from outside.
Yeah.
But given that that's completely within your control, in a sense, where are those abrupt
changes? Yeah, I think it at a really superficial level, it reflects my interest at the time, right? So what I'm looking for. So I didn't show the advertisements, but the advertisements came about because I was just flipping through old architecture magazines trying to find a project I'd never seen before. And then I noticed these advertisements, and I found them to be very sort of humorous, comical, also kind of referencing, say, disciplinary ideas, but again, maybe thinking about, say, the dissemination of images in the world, right? Like advertising, I think, has something to offer in terms of thinking about that, right? Like how an image is produced, how it's composed. Does it sort of communicate a clear and direct message that is easily digestible by, say, a broader audience, but also, say, people in the know, right? So the advertisements in architecture magazines, I think, kind of walk a fine line where they maybe play up, say, disciplinary tropes, but also aim to kind of speak to a larger audience. But those changes, I think the changes also reflect like what I'm working on. So, at one point, I didn't show it here tonight, but we made a proposal for a dog park in downtown Los Angeles. So then I became interested in, say, other types of architecture or other types of architecture that people have made for animals, right? And notably like Cedric Price's aviary, but I was then kind of just like looking, where can I find other sort of examples that kind of like, what's the precedent for a dog park? So maybe that's another way to think about the project of Archive Affinities. It's a sort of reservoir of precedent that also then, maybe becomes references or quotes or sort of, again, material that is sort of filtered into the projects in a number of different ways.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because when you present the work that you show, there's a temptation to see the part as a kind of pixel almost, right? Like irreducible, kind of something that you're not particularly invested in one way or the other until it becomes integrated in this bigger thing. Right?
Yeah.
But that's certainly not the case with the Archive of Affinities, right? Like each one of those things also exists not just as a pixel and a bigger thing, but as there's a sensibility to those images. Right?
Yeah, I would say that's my sensibility, right? Like, and I would say also one thing that's interesting about, I guess maybe that's also goes to practice. So the project of Archive of Affinity I started it when I was a graduate student, on the first day of graduate school, because I couldn't find certain images online, and then I thought, if I can't find them, maybe someone else is also looking for them, and I'll just share them, And so there wasn't some grand idea about it at the time, but I sort of doing it, I also noticed I was starting to refine my own sensibility or develop my own kind of taste about what it is that I like. But then, the word affinity is a really nice word, right? Because it can mean, say, something that I have a personal predilection for, or something that might have a relationship to something else. And that was super interesting to me in terms of thinking about people like Colin Rowe, or like, say, Oswald Matthias Ungers in the book City Metaphors, right? Or, as I mentioned, Gerhard Richter's Atlas. And so, also then the idea of, say, comparing things, or kind of looking at the differences or similarities between things, was kind of a driving force. But then also, the flip side of that is like, that was all also material to make collages, like in a super crude way, right? Like, so when you collapse the distance between two things being compared, like, and you sort of join them, then they become a kind of new thing, right? So, and maybe that's a kind of, say, idea of composition, also that we're also kind of after, which I didn't show tonight, but it's the idea is to say 1 plus any number of objects equals a singular whole, right? Or a recognize that you can sort of have a flicker reading between, say, each individual part, but say also read it as a kind of totality. Painting things one single color certainly helps in, say, reading many different parts as a totality, right? But I would say, more and more as kind of, or as things change, like, it's, I don't know. So, but Archive of Affinities definitely is sort of, but also as I get, when I started as a student, right, I had more time to just do it and just kind of like rummage through the library, rummage through used bookstores, scour eBay, Amazon to try and find like, a $2 A+U from 1984 or something, like as I have less and less time to sort of devote to that project, but because that project in a way yields, at least for me personally, so much kind of, let's say for lack of a better word, wealth in terms of creative wealth, right? In terms of how I can start to produce other new images, it's something that I sort of have to force myself to keep doing. And so in some weird way, it becomes a kind of practice, right? Because it's like, as a student, maybe I went to the library every day or just stayed in the library. Now it's like once a week, maybe once every 2 weeks. And then, blog format allows me to kind of curate it in advance. And so it's now like queued up for like months in advance, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't sort of relate to my kind of interest at the time, or that might be shifted.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I really appreciate the comment about the scanner because,
Yeah.
you know, from today's perspective, of course, there's an easy reading of it as a kind of Pinterest, right?
Sure.
But actually, this is more of a kind of gift or a kind of production
Yeah.
than just kind of lazy.
Yeah. I mean, I guess, yeah. Also, thinking about Pinterest is super interesting, right? Like the you know, I imagine the people here that work with clients, your clients probably send you images from Pinterest of what they like, right? And I absolutely despise Pinterest. I hate it. I hate it with all my heart. But at the same time, like, there's something really amazing about it, right? That this is where it's, you know, if a client is looking at Pinterest, right? Like, that's how they're gonna that's their interaction with architecture, right? And so why aren't we kind of occupying that platform and telling them, you know, or sort of, you know, showing them what better architecture or good architecture could be, or interesting architecture. Also, if you Google any of those, interesting architecture, bad architecture, better architecture, you also get a whole bunch of other crap. But you know who always appears all the time is Frank Gehry. Frank Gehry has somehow managed to like find, like, is always an interesting architecture. So, Morgan.
Thanks for this super lecture. I had a question about where you situate yourself in your work between mass production on the one side and kind of extreme customizability on the other. There's a kind of rhetoric in the photo where, I don't know if you guys are looking to a dollar store,
Yeah.
or the chairs that look like they've been extruded from a Lego mold. On the one hand, but then the reality that all of these are, you know, carefully crafted and you know, there's an artisanal quality to a lot of your stuff, which I think is beautiful and fascinating. So in a sense, there's a kind of tension that reminds me a bit, even if it's aesthetically totally different, it reminds me a bit of Bauhaus design, which had this ideal of...
I'll take that compliment.
which had this ideal of, you know, of mass production, I mean, architecture that was serial and for everybody, but in the end was actually kind of highly fashioned luxury good. So just...
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Maybe the way I would sort of spin it is that, all the material we're using in a way is mass produced, right? So even the like duck from the 99-cent store has been mass produced, but its intention is not to be an architecture model, right? Like, or the pyramid sandcastle is not meant to be in a architecture model, right? Like, it has a different kind of function. So I think already there, we're kind of altering its intended use, or something that is maybe could be thought of as useless, right? Becomes useful for us in a way. And then that material then I guess is further altered, maybe through this, like, say, process, for lack of a better term at the moment, like collage, right? So whether it's kind of adding color, adding additional textures, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, I don't think, if anything, I don't know if we're mass producing anything, right? But we're maybe sort of, say, appropriating things that are mass produced.
The kind of alchemy.
Sure.
Thank you, Andrew, for the lecture. I'm really glad somebody finally brought up an NBA player within the context of architecture. That was the trifecta, because I always saw or read the work as, you know, Rauschenberg meets Shepard Fairey meets Allen Iverson to some extent. But even within all three of those parties, if you will, they do abide by a rule set.
Sure.
That they you know, they are also librarians, much like this is. And so what is that rule set? You know, like you didn't just pick everything out of the 99-cent store. So what?
Sure. So I guess here's a blatant self-promotion. We're selling a zine of the Chicago model, and in that zine there's a text written called 10 Locations, where you can kind of go and select, or which basically further outlines how we select things or look for things. Because I think that's what your question, underlying your question is like, how do we choose? How do we select, right? And so I think it's a number of factors. I think it depends on like what we're actually doing, right? So there's a kind of factor of budget, right? So all these things are kind of cheap because the budgets I work with are very modest, right? So I have to then use things that are inexpensive, right? So, but yeah, I guess maybe like what we're looking at in the 99-cent store is, say, things that are architectural, right? It's obviously like a plastic duck is not architecture, right? But maybe has some kind of architectural quality or resonance, or the kind of ordering of used train models, HO scale train models from eBay, right? Like that there are recognizable facades, and maybe this also goes to say how to sort of talk to a broader audience outside of the discipline of architecture. So what does like say a civilian, right, recognize as architecture, right? Like you go ask a civilian to draw architecture, maybe they'll draw a pitched roof, right? So I think there are things that maybe people recognize as building or as architecture that I'm sort of trying to kind of capture or bring into some of the work, right? So that there's a kind of attempt to reach not just the audience of us, but say a larger audience, or maybe that even goes to the project of Archive Affinities, where it's not necessarily about bringing people to architecture, right? You don't have to go bring someone to go see the Guggenheim or the Bilbao Museum, right? But rather you bring architecture to the people, right? So you sort of disseminate kind of images of architecture to kind of broaden the audience. But I don't think there's an easy way to kind of, in 5 minutes here, to explain the whole kind of selection process, but if you purchase the zine,
Hi, Andrew. Thank you. There's something in the part to whole logic when you're working with found objects versus what I'd say I see in the installations as you're constructing things to appear as though they're found and then assembling them together into larger compositions. I wouldn't say forms, but compositions.
Sure.
So for instance, the installation in the Wedge Gallery, the little, I don't know what you want to call it, like half stud framed red wall appears to be something you might have found off the street that's leaned up against what's it, 7-foot high stud wall that is has something that appears to be found splattered in paint laid on top of it. And the kind of, I think that shift in scale where you are constructing things that appear to be found as opposed to collecting things that are found seems to really bring tectonics into the conversation in a much more significant way, in a way that I find very interesting in how the, let's say, qualities of the graphic expression of these elements articulate how building components do or do not turn a corner.
Sure.
And playfulness between the reality of the tectonic assembly and the expression of it. And I find that, I don't know, to be a really interesting part of the more small scale.
What do you think of the window?
The window seems clearly found, like
Yeah.
very authentic, as opposed to being constructed. So, personally, for me, there's a lack of playfulness in that.
Okay, yeah. So I mean, I guess if I could, I don't know, where can I go buy a large duck, to like alter? So I guess there's also a kind of economy in all of it. I mean, I sort of always go back to the economy of things, I guess, because like if I could go purchase a large duck for an inexpensive price, maybe we would have a large duck in the installation. So, I think actually the more fantastical, speculative projects, like, yeah, in some ways, these installations are like just a little piece of those fantastical speculations. But in my mind, like, I actually want to make those things, the whole thing real, you know, not just a part of it. So, but how that would happen, I mean, it would require like an army.
We have one more question.
Thanks. I noticed, like, over the course of the projects and then some things that I've seen on your site, there's like like an oscillating density relationship between things. Like, sometimes things are just, like, each thing is its own thing and you can see it clearly, and other times it's like a mass in some of the ways that you've already talked about that kind of strategy. But could you just talk like a little bit about your relationship to density and the different decisions you make from project to project, or how that relationship has changed over time?
Yeah. Well, I really like quantity. I like a lot of stuff at once, and so I mean, I guess again it goes back to like maybe there's a sort of practicality to it, right? Like, in some ways, like, if we actually want to start to realize some of these installations, maybe we do have to kind of simplify them, or for lack of a better term, like dumb them down, or like lessen the quantity, right? But that doesn't mean that the, say, strategy of composition or the use of color, or say, you know, that all kind of stays with it, right? So, but also, you know, maybe when I was making the more like speculative models, I was just making them as for fun, you know, like, but also thinking like, yeah, wouldn't it be really cool to like make a building that looks like this? You know, like, I mean, that's, but, and I would still like to do that, but at the same time, I can't do that in the gallery, right? But also, I don't want to just show another model in a gallery, right? So I also want to be able to kind of push ourselves into something that maybe we're a little bit unfamiliar with, right? And I think that really sort of happened, you know, we try to do that at every project, and it depends on what the circumstance of the project is, right? Like, are we running it, or are we under someone else? What's kind of the relationship, right? And so, but it's also like, how can we push what we're doing kind of further along, right? Or like refine it or develop it more or further, so that it, you know, maybe does become quote unquote realer. Because to me, the models are just as real as the installation, right? It's just a matter of their size. I don't know if that kind of answers.
So maybe that's a great question for us to move to the Wedge Gallery. Andrew, thank you so much for coming and lecturing. We really appreciate it.